Neil, if I could bring you in on the logistics side, but you've worn a number of different hats over the years in terms of the air freight industry. Who, in your view, wins and loses? Presumably, the Chinese e-tailer platforms are on the losing side here, but can anyone win, or is this just a negative for air cargo as a whole?
It's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think, the first big loser here is going to be the consumer, right? The consumer is going to end up paying more. They're going to get slower transit times. And so, they've gotten pretty drunk on this e-commerce business. And I think that it's going to be a little bit of a rude awakening for a lot of people that they might be priced out of the market, right? For some of these e-commerce. And it will disproportionately affect sort of the lower income groups, right, that will bear more of the brunt of these price hikes. But putting the consumer aside for the time being, I think that, there are losers, but I think there's also sort of positives and winners through this process. So if I just take a second, clearly, the Chinese e-commerce companies, when de minimis was taken away for China and Hong Kong in May, they were scrambling, right? They didn't expect this to come as quickly as it did. And they certainly lost traction, particularly in their North American business, right? Particularly their US business. And I think year over year in June, I think the e-commerce volumes from China and Hong Kong to the US were down something like 50%, a big, big number, right? And this was a major, major market for them. However, overall Chinese e-commerce volumes, were actually up year over year when you look at sort of the global kilo count. And so what that tells you is that they started to redirect to other markets, right? They stopped their promotions in the US and started looking at other markets. One of the big markets where they pivoted to has been Latin America. And I have a lot of experience in Latin America, so I'll just use that as an example, is that the transit cargo coming through the US to Latin America has absolutely exploded. All of these carriers out of Miami are doing extremely well. Rates on the southbound out of Miami to all locations in Central South America and even many parts of the Caribbean are much higher than they were, before May. And that's because a lot of this volume, it's finding its way through Miami inbound and then heading into Latin America. So I think that if you're asking that, are the air carriers taking a hit? Of course they are. I mean, the trade into the US is down, but those that have the ability to redeploy assets, right, to take advantage of some of these new flows are also finding new opportunities and new markets, right? Instead of flying 10 times a week to Chicago, maybe it's only 4 times a week to Chicago and 6 times a week now to Miami in order to take advantage and try and move these flows to the second carriers that are going. So I don't think it's completely a lose-lose here. And I think when you look at some of the results from the air freight carriers, their second quarter results were actually quite positive, quite good growth, year over year and all of that. But I agree with Brandon. We haven't felt the brunt of this yet. There was a lot of inventory that was sort of pre-staged, right? They're fulfilling as much domestically as they can to avoid. But what I hear is that their long haul demand is starting to come back. I think people are starting to accept that, particularly with China and Hong Kong origin cargo, that the tariffs are here. They're here to stay. And just heard from one of the big Chinese e-tailers that their volumes to the US are beginning to rebound. And so they're coming back. They won't come back to the extent they were. And certainly their sourcing and fulfillment strategy is going to change. But I think that we still have to wait and see over the next 3, 4, 5 months to see what the global impact is going to look like before sort of, I guess, making any final determinations on the impact to the industry. So I'm a little hesitant to call it doomsday for air freight because I just think it's a little too early and not ready to make that call yet.